In 1898, just before sunrise, a county road crew moved through a strip of low earth outside the Missouri River country, cutting into what they thought was only another weather-softened rise in a field no one had bothered to name on newer maps. One of the men was not a scholar, not a historian, not even a foreman, just a laborer with a shovel, a team of mules, and enough years in the ground to know when dirt stops behaving like dirt. He later described the sound first. Not a hollow knock, not loose stone, not timber, something longer, deeper, a hard, echoing drag under packed earth, like iron scraping across the inside of a buried room. They cleared more. The soil gave way in layers, clay, char, fragments of shell, then a slab edge, then another, and then, according to the account that survives only in fragments, they found a chamber so long it did not resemble any grave they had ever seen, not a family crypt, not a military trench, not a cellar. The walls bowed inward in repeating arcs, as if the interior had once been ribbed with fitted stone. Even after collapse, those curved bands still showed through the dirt. Stone ribs, and what sat between them was the part no one knew what to call. Because a grave has proportions, a coffin has limits, human burial follows familiar shapes even when the customs are old. But this chamber stretched beyond those measures, too long for the body it was supposed to hold, too carefully built to be dismissed as a natural void, too deep inside a mound field to be explained away as a recent intrusion. Then, almost immediately, the language around it changed. What had been described as a chamber became a disturbance. What had been measured became irregular stone placement. What had drawn men from nearby properties to stare in silence was reduced in later mention to subsurface anomalies of no lasting significance. And that is where this story begins, not with what was found, but with how fast it had to be renamed. Because Missouri's mound fields have always occupied an uncomfortable edge between history and memory. They were too large to ignore, too numerous to erase completely, and too old to fit neatly inside the version of the continent most people were taught to imagine. Even now, fields that look ordinary from a road can hide rises under tree lines, low humps in pasture, or strange ground that never quite settles after rain. So what happens when one of those mounds opens? What happens when the chamber inside is too long for any known grave? And what do you do when the surviving descriptions keep circling the same image again and again, like witnesses trying not to say the quiet part out loud? Stone ribs, long cavity, fitted interior, sealed earth. Because maybe this was only an odd burial. Maybe it was a collapsed ceremonial chamber. Or maybe the official language changed because the original discovery threatened something much bigger than one forgotten mound in Missouri. By the end of this story, the chamber itself will matter less than the pattern around it, the missing pages, the softened terms, the old accounts that describe huge foundations beneath innocent ground, and the possibility that what lay beneath Missouri's mound fields was never just a grave at all.
To understand why this discovery feels so wrong, you have to understand the landscape it came from. Missouri is full of places that look finished on the surface, but unfinished underneath. River bluffs, buried terraces, old crossings, ridges cut by runoff that expose brick where there should be none, stone where no recent builder claims to have laid it, and low earthworks that older residents used to recognize before newer generations learned to drive past them without seeing anything at all. That matters because mound fields were not random hills. Even in damaged condition, they marked intention, layout, sequence, repetition, human placement across time. And once you accept that, the next question becomes dangerous very quickly. If the ground itself was arranged with purpose, what exactly was being protected beneath it? The first credibility layer in this case comes from how ordinary the earliest witnesses seem. A road crew, nearby landowners, a clerk asked to note dimensions, not treasure hunters, not performers. The story is sticky precisely because the people attached to it do not sound like myth makers. They sound like men who saw something they were not prepared to interpret. One remembered that the chamber did not open like a pit. It revealed itself in parts, as if the roof had slumped without fully breaking. Another noted that the walls appeared set in successive inward courses, which is the kind of detail people do not invent unless they stood there long enough to notice craftsmanship. A third account, passed later through a local recollection, claimed the interior floor was too evenly laid for chance cavity. Then comes the strangest line of all. The chamber was long enough to embarrass comparison. That phrase should stop you. Because comparison to what? If the men on site were expecting a burial, then comparison meant a grave. If they were expecting a cellar, then comparison meant a room. But if the witness refused to name the object by either category, it suggests the proportions themselves were the problem. The space did not fit the explanation waiting for it. This is where the official record begins to harden. Survey language grew cautious, mentions narrowed. What should have become a curiosity instead became a footnote. And when later summaries referenced opened mounds in the region, they often emphasized damaged contexts, uncertain provenance, or intrusive digging, all useful phrases if you want the public to imagine confusion instead of design. But confusion is not what the earliest descriptions suggest. They suggest sequence, they suggest structure, and they suggest whoever built that chamber expected weight above it and time around it. Then the witness layer gets darker. A retired local school teacher, writing decades later about stories repeated in her family, described older men who would not walk the field after heavy rain because the ground showed lines. Not cracks, not sink marks, lines, as if buried courses beneath the surface became visible for a few hours when the soil darkened. Another account mentioned that cattle refused one particular rise after spring flooding exposed pale stone edges under the grass. It would be easy to laugh at that until you notice how often hidden structures first survive as behavior before they survive as paper. Animals avoid a line. Farm tools catch the same buried edge. Water reveals geometry. And people, long before experts arrive, learn where not to step. So by the time later investigators reduced these places to damaged earthworks and uncertain finds, the older memory had already formed a very different picture. Not isolated mounds, but a landscape honeycombed with chambers, alignments, and buried architecture no one wanted to map too carefully. Which raises the next question. If the Missouri chamber really was only one strange grave, why do so many of the surrounding details sound like the edges of a much larger system?
The deeper you go into stories like this, the more the evidence changes shape. At first, you expect clean proof, a report, a photograph, a page with measurements and signatures. But hidden cases rarely survive that way. What survives are mismatches. Mentions that should have led somewhere but don't, catalog references without contents, notes copied from notes whose originals are gone. The outline remains, but the center has been taken. And that is exactly what makes this chamber so difficult to shake. Because once the first mention appears, smaller details begin surfacing around it like debris after a river shift. There was reportedly a field sketch, not a finished plate, not a published figure, just a rough draft showing a long internal cavity beneath a rounded rise with curved side elements marked at intervals. That sketch, if it existed, does not appear where it should. A county storage move decades later may have displaced local materials, or perhaps it never made it into permanent custody at all. Either way, its absence is not neutral. In buried history cases, vanished sketches matter almost as much as surviving ones. Then there are the secondary witnesses. A farm heir, interviewed much later, claimed his grandfather once described stone ribs showing through the dirt like a giant basket turned into rock. That image sounds almost poetic, which is exactly why skeptics dismiss it. But strange discoveries are often remembered through metaphor first, precision second. Another local memory tells of boys slipping into a partial opening on a nearby mound and finding not treasure, but a downward run of fitted stone too smooth for roots to make. They were chased off, the entrance collapsed later, and the story survived only because one of those boys became an old man who repeated it every winter. Too smooth for roots to make. That line belongs to the same world as the chamber. Then a more unsettling clue appears in the form of silence. In several discussions of regional mounds, some descriptions focus obsessively on pottery shards, charcoal, bone fragments, and small artifacts, all useful, all important, but when a text gives great care to scattered material and almost none to major structural features, you have to ask whether the writer was uninterested, unconvinced, or under pressure to avoid a larger implication. Because structure changes the argument. A loose artifact can be moved, misplaced, misread. A built chamber cannot. And once a chamber exists, other questions arrive fast. Who designed the geometry? Why bury an engineered interior beneath monumental earth? Why make the space longer than expected? Was it symbolic, practical, ceremonial, or even something stranger? Was the chamber empty when opened, disturbed earlier, cleared intentionally? That last possibility terrifies me most, because if the chamber was opened long before modern notice, then what the road crew found was not a complete site. It was the remainder of a site after intervention, after removal, after someone already decided what should or should not stay underground. And suddenly the story expands from mystery to motive. Not just who built it, who managed it afterwards, who reburied what could not be explained, who learned that the simplest way to control a discovery is not to deny it loudly, but to leave it half described until everyone grows tired of chasing it. The chamber remains compelling for one reason above all. Every surviving detail points not toward a random grave, but toward a concealed interior large enough, deliberate enough, and strange enough to force a choice between revision and suppression. And history, when cornered, often chooses suppression first.
This is the point where one chamber stops being one chamber. Because the moment you start paying attention to buried anomalies in one place, you begin recognizing the same pattern elsewhere. Lower levels under old towns, sealed basements beneath later foundations, streets that sit one full story above older doorways, brick vaults found under courthouses that were never mentioned in original plans, staircases descending to walls that should not exist below the accepted build line. Again and again, the modern surface appears younger than the geometry beneath it. Missouri is not isolated from that pattern. It sits inside it. The mound fields matter because they bridge two worlds most people keep separate: prehistoric earthworks and buried architecture. One is allowed to be ancient, the other is allowed to be structural. But once those categories meet, once a mound contains a chamber that feels architectural rather than merely funerary, the official comfort disappears. That is when the language of containment shows up. Subsurface irregularity, ceremonial uncertainty, disturbed context, local exaggeration. Notice how these phrases work. None of them fully deny. They blur, they weaken, they dissolve edges until the public can no longer tell the difference between an unsupported rumor and an underdescribed fact. And that is useful if the broader pattern is embarrassing.
Because imagine what happens if the chamber beneath the mound is acknowledged as part of a system. Then the mound is no longer just a hill of ritual soil. It becomes a capstone, a seal, a marker over something that was meant to outlast weather, war, and memory. That possibility also explains the testimony about repeated lines after rain, exposed stone arcs, and low rises that never behaved like natural ground. It explains why some old properties were worked around instead of through. It explains why excavation accounts sometimes read as if the earth had to be persuaded to give up shape it had hidden for generations. And then comes the institutional problem. If the buried features are older than the accepted local settlement history, someone must explain who built them. If their dimensions do not match expected burial norms, someone must explain their purpose. If similar anomalies recur across separate sites, someone must explain why the pattern was not front and center from the beginning. That is where suppression does not always look like a conspiracy in the theatrical sense. Sometimes it looks smaller, colder, more bureaucratic. A site is logged poorly. A sketch is misplaced. An artifact is preserved while the chamber around it is barely described. A newspaper paragraph is clipped but never followed. A difficult feature becomes a private oddity instead of a public question. And after 2 or 3 generations, the silence does the rest. The most effective burial is not dirt, it's administrative neglect. Still, the theory grows because the pattern grows. Some researchers suspect these mound chambers were ceremonial vaults tied to lineages or cosmology. Others think they covered older subterranean spaces inherited from cultures already forgotten by later builders. The more radical view is darker still, that the mound fields were not only memorial sites, but protective overlays placed above entrances, chambers, or remains, too anomalous to leave exposed. If that sounds extreme, remember the title of this case is not that something was buried. Everyone agrees something was buried. The real question is why the chamber had to be so long, so reinforced, and so quickly reduced in the record once men started noticing the stone ribs still showing through.
Now we arrive at the implication no one wants to say plainly. What if the length of the chamber was the message? Not an error, not an exaggeration, not a misread measurement, a deliberate proportion. Because throughout hidden history lore, the most explosive claims do not begin with bones, they begin with scale. Doorways too high, foundations too broad, beds of stone too long, graves whose dimensions force later observers into awkward vocabulary because the obvious comparison leads somewhere they are not willing to go. And Missouri's chamber sits right on that fault line. If the cavity was truly too long for any known grave in local memory, then one of 3 things follows. Either the burial tradition was unlike anything the witnesses recognized, or the chamber served a function other than burial, or, and this is where the buried giants obsession enters the room, the proportions once matched occupants, artifacts, or ceremonial displays far larger than official comfort allows. I am not asking you to leap blindly into folklore. I am asking you to notice how folklore forms around repeated discomfort. Large remains reported, then lost. Oversized vaults mentioned, then minimized. Old newspaper lines about strange bones or impossible measurements dismissed as frontier sensationalism, even when the surrounding details feel painfully specific. Most of those stories cannot be proved cleanly now. That is true, but the absence of clean proof after removal, dispersal, ridicule, and a century of neglect is not the same as proof of innocence. Sometimes it is exactly what you would expect if the evidence was fragmented on contact.
And if the chamber was not about giant remains, the civilizational implication may be even bigger. Because then we're looking at engineered subterranean space inside a mound field in a way that suggests planning, stoneworking, load management, and symbolic concealment all operating together. That means the people responsible were not merely piling earth over the dead. They were designing hidden interiors to persist beneath a controlled landscape. That is architecture with intention, memory encoded underground. Think about what that does to the official story. It means the past under your feet may not be simpler than the past in books. It may be more complex, more layered, and more deliberately sealed. It means lost civilizations do not always vanish in oceans or deserts. Sometimes they survive as awkward chambers under farmland, as lower architecture under later streets, as forbidden dimensions in reports no one bothered to reread. So maybe the chamber beneath Missouri's mound fields held giant remains. Maybe it held offerings, relics, or an empty ceremonial span whose scale itself was sacred. Or maybe its greatest secret was simpler, proof that someone built below the earth with a confidence history no longer knows how to admit. Whichever answer you choose, the effect is the same. The ground stops feeling innocent. And that is why this story lingers. Not because we have every page. We do not. Not because every witness agrees. They never do. Not because the chamber can be neatly displayed in a museum case with a polished label and approved dimensions. It cannot. This story lingers because a handful of surviving descriptions point in the same direction with unnerving consistency. A mound field in Missouri, a chamber opened by ordinary hands, a length no one was comfortable naming, curved interior stonework still visible through soil. Then softer language, missing follow-through, silence where detail should have been. If you have followed buried history cases for long enough, you know that silence has a shape. It is rarely total. More often, it leaves behind impressions, like timbers removed from wet clay. You do not see the thing itself anymore. You see the cavity where it used to be. And once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. In the sealed basement, no blueprint mentions. In the lower windows, bricked shut beneath street level. In the grave, too large for the explanation attached to it. In the testimony preserved only because one old person refused to tell the story before they died. That may be the real reason hidden history pulls people in so hard. It is not just about the past. It is about permission. Permission to notice when the official version feels thinner than the ground beneath it. Permission to ask why certain discoveries are always described just enough to neutralize them, but never enough to resolve them. Permission to believe that forgetting can be managed, not accidental. And if that is true, then Missouri's buried chamber is not only a local mystery, it is a warning. A warning that entire chapters of human memory can be pushed down, paved over, renamed, and left for weather to guard. A warning that what survives may come to us only in witness fragments, damaged records, and physical details too strange to disappear completely. Stone ribs, long cavity, sealed earth, a grave that was never comfortable being called a grave. Maybe one day another field will open, another rain will darken the ground in lines, another foundation will crack and reveal an older geometry beneath it. And when that happens, the people who recognize the pattern first will not be the ones waiting for permission to look. They will be the ones who remember stories like this. So if you're still here, you're probably not here for easy history. You're here because some part of you knows the past is not gone. It is covered, layered, managed. And sometimes, if the soil shifts just enough, it shows you the outline of what was never meant to stay visible. Beneath Missouri's buried fields, the chamber may still be there, collapsed, emptied, forgotten on purpose, too long for any known grave, and still, after all this time, the stone ribs show through.